Well, I'm glad you could drop in for today's podcast, number 16 in my series Colonies to Colossus, The Rise of a Giant. Today we're going to be talking about colonial Georgia. Now, because Georgia was the last of the 13 original colonies, I had someone ask me if this would be the last podcast in my series, and the answer is no. I have at least 20 more podcasts, and probably more than that, already on the drawing table. These will include such topics as the Iroquois Confederation, religion in the colonies, the French Empire, the Continental Congress, the economy of the North American colonies, the first state constitutions, the Dominion of New England, the French and Indian War, the American Revolution, which I'll have several podcasts on that, and the U.S. Constitution, how it was written, and I have several podcasts in mind just dealing with the government of the colonies. In fact, the next podcast, number 17, we will look specifically at how colonial governors operated, how they were appointed, and what their powers were. So this will not be the last podcast. Now, as I just mentioned, Georgia was the last of the colonies founded by the English in North America, at least colonies that became states later in the United States. In fact, Georgia was founded so late that many of its founders were still alive during the War of Independence. Georgia was the southernmost colony, too. It existed with the constant threat of invasion, both by the Spanish in Florida and possible invasion by the French and their Indian allies from the west. Both Spain and France had claims on the land in which Georgia was founded. The trustees who operated the colony of Georgia envisioned it as a haven for England's unfortunate poor. They also envisioned a colony free of slaves where the warm climate could produce rare and expensive luxury items, especially silk. Within a few years after its founding, the original vision of Georgia as a haven for the unfortunate poor gave way to the realities, and Georgia began to look increasingly like the other southern colonies, with the now familiar plantation system and slavery. When the American War of Independence came to Georgia, Georgia's backcountry became the scene of bitter partisan fighting that included personal brutality and torture. Since the 1520s, the Spanish had been exploring the land that would later be called Georgia. Soon, a string of Spanish missions, mostly on the coastal islands, was established that lasted until just after 1700. But Indian uprisings and raids by the English and their Indian allies forced the Spanish to quit the area and confine their efforts to Florida. It's strange that Spain had a presence in Georgia for over 100 years, and no trace of it really survived into modern times. The story of English Georgia begins with a man named James Oglethorpe, who was born in 1696. Oglethorpe was a member of Parliament. He had a close friend who died in jail. This friend was a debtor. Back then, if you had debts that you couldn't pay, you could end up in jail. This friend didn't have the money to pay the fees to get him out of the bad part of the jail, and he died as a result of smallpox. This led Oglethorpe to press Parliament to investigate the English jail systems, which were pretty horrific. As a result of Parliament's inquiry into the horrible conditions of the jails in England, almost 10,000 people were freed, and several corrupt jail wardens were prosecuted. Oglethorpe and some of his other friends decided it was time to help what he called England's unfortunate poor. He thought the best way to help them would be to set up a colony in North America where they could work and own land and become productive. The king granted Oglethorpe and his friends a charter, and in the charter called the colony Georgia, which makes sense since the king was named George II. The king apparently agreed with Oglethorpe and his friends in their sentiments in wanting to help the poor, because in the charter the king wrote, "Whereas we are credibly informed that many of our poor subjects are, through misfortunes and want of employment, reduced to great necessity, insomuch as by their labor they are not able to provide a maintenance for themselves and families, we think it highly becoming our crown and royal dignity to protect all our loving subjects, be they ever so distant from us, to extend our fatherly compassion, even to the meanest and most unfortunate of our people, and to relieve the wants of our above-mentioned poor subjects, and that it will be highly conducive for accomplishing those ends, that a regular colony of the said poor people be settled and established in the southern territories of Carolina." Another important consideration mentioned by the king in the charter, and something that was a real practical strategic consideration, was the need for a buffer between South Carolina and the Spanish in Florida, and also a buffer to protect the other colonies from the interior Indians and their French allies. South Carolina was very enthusiastic about helping set up Georgia, and they did lend a great deal of support as well as sending food and stuff when the first colonists arrived there. There are a couple of interesting and important things I want to point out about the charter that the king granted to Oglethorpe and his friends. Technically, they were proprietors, just like the Baltimores were in Maryland or William Penn was in Pennsylvania and Delaware. However, they were shorn of their powers to do the medieval-style government that was granted to the Penns or the Baltimore family. In fact, the charter calls Oglethorpe and his friends trustees, and it constantly refers to their organization as a corporation. This is probably also the result of the increasing commercialization of English society, but I think also it's the result of the Crown not really trusting proprietary-style governments. They were never popular with the colonists that live in them. The charter specified that the trustees could not own land in the colony, nor could they even profit from it. And in fact, it only gave them a 21-year existence, at which point the colony then would revert to a crown colony administered directly by the king. So you could really say that Oglethorpe and the other trustees were running this colony pretty much out of the goodness of their heart because they weren't gaining anything from it. And that speaks somewhat to their high ideals and their good intentions. In 1733, Oglethorpe arrived with the first group of colonists and with the help of some South Carolina Rangers began looking at sites to build the first city, which they would call Savannah. They selected a site that was on a small bluff on the south side of the Savannah River. And after obtaining permission from the local Yamacraw Indian chieftain, a man named Tomo Chichi, Oglethorpe began to lay out the town that would be called Savannah. It was in an excellent location because it was on slightly elevated ground, it was above the swampy ground, and it was surrounded by farmable land and forests, which could provide both farm products and wood to build houses and palisade forts. Oglethorpe organized the town into lots. 10 lots equaled a block or tithing, and the chief officer of each tithing was a tithing man. 4 blocks constituted a ward, and each ward had a chief officer named a constable. As laid out by Oglethorpe, Savannah originally had 6 wards, and in the center of each ward is a public square. In modern terms, let me give you the streets that would have outlined the city where it was when Oglethorpe first laid it out. On the west side was Drayton Street. The south boundary of the town would be Oglethorpe Avenue, and the east boundary of the town would be Broad Street. If you look at a satellite or aerial photograph of Savannah today, you can clearly see this pattern and the original 6 squares in the center of each block. This pattern was used as Savannah grew up until 1850, and in fact, when the Indian chief Tomo Chichi, who had granted the land to the colonists, when he died, Oglethorpe gave him a funeral with full military honors and buried Tomo Chichi in one of these town squares. Soon after the town was laid out, Oglethorpe had a palisade fort constructed to surround the town with blockhouses, and he also encouraged the colonists to engage in target practice so they would be prepared in case there was ever an invasion. In 1735, Oglethorpe selected a site for another town, which he called Augusta. Augusta was the northernmost town in Georgia and became the center of Indian trade for Georgia as well. As I mentioned earlier, the trustees who set up Georgia and operated it were people of high ideals and good visions, but they weren't necessarily always so realistic about what Georgia could do or become. They all believed that Georgia was near the latitude of the Garden of Eden and that they would be able to produce rare and exotic products there, especially silk. In fact, the first seal of the colony, on the verso of it, there's a picture of a silkworm, which gives you some idea of what they were expecting it to become. In fact, they were so intent on producing silk that they actually required the colonists to plant a certain number of mulberry trees, which is the tree the silkworm needs to survive. Each colonist was required to plant a certain number of mulberry trees in their plot of land. They also hoped to produce wine, which they did to some degree, but never turned out to be the same quality as the European wines they were hoping that they could displace in the market. One of the interesting things that the trustees did was they established the trustee garden on the east side of Savannah. Today that would be on the east side of Broad Street. In this botanic garden, they hoped to grow things that would later become wealth-producing, spices, olives, coffee, all kinds of plants that they hoped from there would spread out to the other areas of the colony. So it was a place of experimentation as well. In that garden, the trustees had a small cottage built that was for the gardener. It was later turned into a tavern. In fact, it was incorporated into a bigger building, which is still there today, and is now a restaurant called Pirate's House, right on the east side of Broad Street, just a little south of the Savannah River. In 1750, the trustees allowed the introduction of slaves into Georgia. This is really not new because there'd already been slavery there, even though it was technically against the rules that the trustees had provided. But this was a very controversial move. The trustees had been very much against slavery. Not only did they oppose it on moral grounds, but they also opposed it for the simple fact that slaves would take away labor that otherwise free white people could do, and so therefore it would constrict the labor market. On the other side, you had people that could make money off slavery, and there were a lot of people at the time who believed that white people were not suited to do hard work in hot climates, only in cold climates. And in the end, these arguments in favor of slavery prevailed, and they ended up allowing it there. England, France, Spain, and the Dutch were constantly getting into wars with each other, and these wars naturally spilled over into their American colonies. One of the wars that I think is interesting to mention, simply because I like the name of it, is the War of Jenkins Ear. The Spanish were not noted for their gentle treatment when they captured English privateers. Captain Jenkins was a captain of an English privateer. When he was captured, the Spanish reportedly cut off his ear. Jenkins kept the ear in a little box, and he actually presented it to Parliament, which caused an outrage, and the English public became churned up for war. It was into this situation that Georgia was launched as a colony. Invasion forces went back and forth, with the Spanish down in Florida fighting against the English in South Carolina and Georgia, but neither side could really prevail. There's one interesting story where Oglethorpe used a clever trick to get the Spanish to evacuate an island. A fairly large Spanish force had come up with Florida with the idea of wiping out Georgia and capturing Savannah. It was a strong enough force it probably could have done so. The Spanish force was on an island off the coast of Georgia. Oglethorpe didn't have enough men to attack it. One of the captives that he had escaped and went to the Spanish, so Oglethorpe sent or released another prisoner, and this time he made sure a note was on the prisoner, as though it was a note to the first guy who escaped, telling him to keep the Spanish on the island as long as possible because a large English force was coming from the north. When the released prisoner got to the Spanish camp, they found the note on him and became worried that there really was a larger English force coming from the north, and they ended up evacuating the island. By all descriptions, the Spanish force probably would have been powerful enough to take over the colony of Georgia. So maybe in this case, Oglethorpe helped save the colony. Oglethorpe wasn't a brilliant military strategist, but it is to his credit to the fact that Georgia did not lose any territory to the Spanish during these wars. The year 1752 was an important year in the history of Georgia because that was the year it became a royal colony. The trustees had given up their rights to the colony and surrendered them to the crown, and now it was directly administered by the king. This meant that from now on the king would appoint the governor and also be much more involved in the affairs of the colony. This is also the year that Georgia begins in a very big way to become much more like South Carolina and like the other southern colonies, which was a process that had been taking place gradually in any case. Gone were the experimental days of trying to grow silk and wine and other exotic things. Georgia was now growing things like indigo and rice, just like South Carolina, although Georgia never had quite the slave population that South Carolina did. In fact, no colony had the slave population that South Carolina did. One of the questions that comes up is why weren't they growing more cotton? That seems like such a characteristic crop of the South today, so why weren't they growing it? Well, the fact is they were growing some cotton, but the short story is that until the 1790s, after the invention of the cotton gin, you couldn't really grow or produce cotton profitably. After the invention of the cotton gin, cotton became enormously profitable, but that would be several decades away. While the trustees ruled Georgia, there was no official church. All Protestant denominations were welcome. There were the usual prohibitions on Roman Catholics, however. But that all changed after Georgia became a royal colony. The legislature passed an act making the Anglican Church, or Church of England, the official church of the colony, and it was quickly divided into parishes. In fact, representation in the assembly was by parish. Realistically, this didn't change much. People were still of other religions there, although there was one Baptist preacher that was arrested for preaching without a license. Two important religious figures that spent some important time in Georgia were John Wesley and George Whitefield, both of whom were involved in the founding of the Methodist Church. I'll have much more to say about these important persons in a future podcast where we discuss the religion of the colonies. Another very important change that occurred once Georgia became a royal colony was the formation of a legislature, a true legislature. The trustees tried to run the colony from London, which didn't really work very well, and it wasn't only until after the time that Georgia became a royal colony that a true legislature was created, a legislature with legislative powers. The first man appointed by the king to be the royal governor of Georgia was a man named John Reynolds. He arrived in the colony in October of 1754 and took the oath of office with great fanfare. A few days later, he was meeting with his council, and in fact, they were in the process of discussing the decrepit condition of the building they were meeting in, when at the other end of the building, some chimney stacks fell over. I don't know if anyone took that as a bad omen, but it happened. In 1763, the British won the French and Indian War and were in control of Florida. This was good for Georgia because Georgia no longer had to worry about Spanish invasions from Florida. It also left Georgia in a strong position in trading with the Indians because now the Indians couldn't play one European power off against another. But it also contributed to an independent attitude, not only in Georgia but in all the colonies as well. They were beginning to resist royal authority, and they also didn't like the idea of having taxes imposed upon them, and they questioned why they even needed British supervision to begin with. By 1776, Georgia had a population of probably between 45,000 and 50,000 people, and the events there leading up to independence were pretty much identical to how they unfolded in the other colonies. The assembly would start taking measures the governor didn't approve of, the governor would dissolve the assembly, and the assembly simply would move somewhere else and begin enacting measures to take control of the colony's government, which is exactly what happened in colonial Georgia. The royal governor of Georgia at that time, Governor Wright, who was actually one of the more able and capable governors, soon found himself with little authority. This was pretty much what happened in every one of the colonies. In January of 1776, Governor Wright was arrested and placed under house arrest. In a letter to Lord Dartmouth, Governor Wright expressed his frustration in these words. He said, "I apprehend there will be nothing but cabals and combinations, and the peace of the province and minds of the people continually heated, disturbed, and distracted. America is now become, or indisputably ere long will be, such a vast and powerful and opulent dominion that I humbly conceive in order to restore and establish real and substantial harmony, affection, and confidence, it may be found advisable to settle the line with respect to taxation." 4 weeks after Governor Wright was arrested and placed under house arrest, he escaped at night to a British warship and left the colony. Interestingly, in 1779, when the British retook control of Georgia for a short time, Governor Wright was reestablished as the royal governor there. This was the only time in all the colonies in which a royal governor was reestablished back in his position of power once the colony had been taken control of by the rebels, but it only lasted a short time. During the American Revolution, Georgia's back country was arguably one of the worst places to be. There were scenes of torture and cruelty and brutality. One loyalist was rounded up and tied to a tree, and his feet were burned, and he lost several toes. In another case, some loyalist partisan officers captured the wife of a patriot leader and tortured her just for vengeance. Vengeance often led to vengeance. British officials in neighboring Florida sponsored raids and attacks from Florida into Georgia. One of these raiders was a man named Daniel McGirth. He had once been a patriot, but some rough treatment persuaded him to join the British, and motivated purely by vengeance and sponsored by British officials in Florida, he left wide swaths of destruction and death in Georgia's backcountry. Georgia officials tried to put a stop to some of this by invading British Florida. How strange it is, they used to worry about the Spanish invading them, now they had to worry about their mother country invading them from Florida. There's one final interesting note I'd like to end this podcast on. In 1785, after the War of Independence was over and the British recognized us as an independent nation, John Adams was appointed as our ambassador to the British, and he at one point was able to meet with James Oglethorpe in London, who had founded the colony. As far as I don't know what James Oglethorpe's opinion of independence was, or if he had one even, but it's kind of an interesting detail to end this podcast. Thanks for listening. For further reading, I recommend the following books and articles. Colonial Georgia, A History by Kenneth Coleman. The Quest for Power, The Lower Houses of Assembly in the Southern Royal Colonies, 1689 to 1776 by Jack P. Green. A Battlefield Atlas of the American Revolution by Craig L. Simons. The Arrest of Georgia's Royal Governor, Sir James Wright by Greg Brooking, published in the Journal of the American Revolution, May 9, 2014. The Confiscation of Loyalist Property in Georgia, 1782 to 1786, by Robert S. Lambert, published in the William and Mary Quarterly, Volume 20, Number 1, January 1963, and Daniel McGirth, Banditti on the Southern Frontier, by Wayne Lynch, published in the Journal of the American Revolution, August 23, 2016.